I guess I'll wait another 30 seconds. People are still coming in. Okay, let's get started. Let me share my slides. Okay, so I guess good morning to me and good afternoon, evening to wherever you may be. So first of all, let me thank again the organizers of the overall series from Bread. And this is something we're really proud of having put together based on the very popular responses to the virtual telecasting of the Bread conferences. And I guess the one blessing of this pandemic has been the recognition that we can really make all of these content available globally. So thanks to the organizers, and I'm very happy to be part of this. So as this is the 5th lecture in, I think, a 9 or 10 lecture sequence on education. So what I'm going to do is just take us one slide quickly to recap. Why does education matter? Why are we literally kicking off this entire sequence with education? And it's because human capital is just a key determinant of both growth at the aggregate level, as well as the ability of individuals to participate in the growth process. So it's one of the robust relations that shows up in cross-country analysis of growth, as well as growth accounting. And it's also something that allows individuals to have the skills to obtain the jobs and be able to participate in an aggregate growth process. So Mark has already talked a fair bit about the returns to education and why being educated allows you to obtain higher returns. But education is not just about human capital and growth. It also matters intrinsically. So if you think about Amartya Sen's capabilities view of development, about what is the point of development, it's not GDP per se, because GDP is just an abstraction that you use to then consume things that make you better off, okay? But I think what's important in the capabilities framework is that the goal of development is not just to have more income, but it is to have a more empowered life that allows you more agency to live the kind of life of your own choosing. And so in that, and so regardless of economic returns, even if the economic returns in terms of wages were not that high, let's say, we have lower, quote unquote, traditionally measured returns to education for women because of lower labor force participation rates, but that shouldn't mean, of course, like Mark said, that's also switching over time. But it doesn't mean that we only think about education in terms of the economic returns. We also care about education intrinsically, and so education and health therefore have a bit of a special place in development because they both count for human capital. It makes you more productive, but it also counts intrinsically as some of the things we're trying to get done as part of the development process. Okay, so now, why should there be policy interventions in education? I think, it's often common to just assume that because something is good, that there needs to be public intervention. That's not true. So you really do need to think first about what the market failures are, why the kind of laissez-faire outcome might be suboptimal, and then understand the nature of those market failures before you come in and think about the nature of the public intervention. So we won't have time to talk about all this. Mark covered this briefly, but there's many reasons for why demand may be suboptimal. Okay, so people make decisions in education based on their information, which they may not have about the right returns to education. There's credit constraints, there's risk and uncertainty. So even if the expected return to education is positive, there's a distribution around those returns. And so it might be that you can't afford the risk of going and paying for school and not getting a job. And then the decisions are made by parents as opposed to children. And you might have very different discount rates between parents, children, and society. And then there's also lots of theoretical reasons to think that there might be spillovers. And, it could go negative, in fact, but the case for intervention is usually that there's positive spillovers, that my being educated makes you more productive. So if you look at Michael Kramer's famous 93 paper in the QJE on O-ring, it's about, a multiplicative production function where each person's productivity actually makes the other person more productive. Each person's education or skills makes the other person more productive, okay? So in those settings, you would get underinvestment in education, and that would warrant a case for public intervention. Now, there's also suboptimal supply. So if you think about traditionally, before modern mass public education, the way people would get education for their kids was the very rich would hire private tutors. Okay. And so even now, people kind of get their own private tutors for music lessons or tennis lessons. And we don't quite think that there needs to be a coordinated policy intervention on that. But when it comes to basic schooling, right, there's economies of scale. And so the most expensive part of running a school is the teacher. And a school where you have 20 to 25 kids per teacher is much more cost effective as a way of delivering education than every person having their own private tutors. Okay. But that requires coordination. It requires people to come together and saying, this is going to be more cost effective if we in fact build a school. So in fact, the original public good, and why in places like the US, education is still very much a local public good and local public finance, is people really just got together in communities and made contributions that would then pay for the school and pay for the teacher. But over time, this is a function that's been taken over by higher levels of government, especially in low and middle income countries, because you're trying to accelerate the provision of education as opposed to wait for the organic creation of schools by communities. Okay, so basically, governments typically run public education systems to address these market failures, but they also have other goals. Okay, so as economists, sometimes it's very common to think that the main reason governments run schooling systems is because we care about human capital. But we'll also talk about the sorting and screening function next time. But there's a goal which I'm just going to mention in passing, which is historically, if you look at one of the reasons governments have created education, have run education systems, it's because they also care about the content of education and what is being taught. So one way to think about this is most of economics essentially assumes that people's preferences are given, and then that you have people are characterized by their utility functions, which in turn represents their preferences, and that they're making decisions to maximize that utility. Okay, but as economists, traditionally, we've not asked about where do the preferences come from, and preferences are often formed in childhood, formed by parents, by communities, by schools. And schools are a very big part of preference formation. And that's kind of what makes education intrinsically more political than we think it is, because the content of education is, in fact, something that is deeply contested. And so we're now starting to see work. I don't think we have any curriculum papers in this module, but for those of you interested, some of the most interesting recent work in education has come in the context of preference formation. So Seema and Diva and Tarun have this recent paper on gender attitudes that's forthcoming in the ER. There have been papers on curriculum in China. There have been papers on other aspects of curriculum. Okay, so we're not going to talk too much about that, but just the larger point I want you to know is that it's not just about human capital, but it's also about preference formation. And so my UCSD colleague, Agustina Paglayan, who's a political scientist, has done some historical work documenting that, in fact, the biggest reason for government spending on public education ends up being this preference formation aspect of it. Okay, but we're not going to talk too much about it. But the main point is that's kind of one of the reasons why the governments typically run public education systems. And as with many other areas of publicly run systems, there end up being massive inefficiencies, which is kind of what we're going to talk about mostly today. Okay, so education for all has been a top global priority, pushed by the global development community and acted on with a surprising amount of enthusiasm by developing countries around the world. Okay, so the good news is that there's large expansions in education enrollment, right? And Isaac showed you some nice pictures on this, and that basically school enrollment and completion rates in low and middle income countries are much, much higher than what they were in OECD countries at a similar level of income. The less good news is that there's very weak translation of inputs, both resources and time, into learning outcomes. And so the broad determinants of school quality, I'll come back and talk about learning and the income learning gradient. So normally the traditional views of school quality and most education policymakers around the world still mainly think about quality as inputs. Okay, so if you ask an education advocate or an education minister, what have you done for education? Chances are 9 times out of 10 they will point towards the budget, and the advocates will complain about the budget being too low, and the government will be proud about saying we've spent more money on education. Okay, but what Isaac has shown you last time, and which I'll repeat in a few settings, is that the correlation between and even tons of experimental studies show that there's it's not that the inputs don't matter at all, but that the translation of the inputs into outcomes into learning outcomes seems pretty weak. And so generally, the broad view in this literature is that two of the key binding constraints, the two things that really seem to matter the most, are pedagogy, right? Which is what is happening inside the classroom, which Esther talked about a little bit, and I'll talk again a little bit tomorrow. And then there's governance, okay, which is the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today, which is, like I said, you've got, for the most part, publicly provided education run by a public education system, which means it's being managed at the same level of quality as government enterprises more generally. And that ends up being pretty weak, which is what we'll talk a lot about today. And then tomorrow's lecture is about technology, and so technology in a way is a cross-cutting force multiplier that allows us to potentially alleviate a series of constraints. So I'll talk mainly about technology and pedagogy tomorrow, but we'll also talk a little bit about how technology can help improve governance. Okay. So quick note on the readings. So in particular, I want to recommend those two handbook chapters, which I think Isaac also put on his reading list. And so for PhD students in particular, this is handbook chapters are just a really useful resource to get caught up on the literature. They're already about 5 years old, but I think the main themes continue to hold. So the first paper, which I did with Paul Dlevy there, is a more standard handbook chapter that's reviewing the evidence. And then the other handbook chapter, which because I'd ended up needing to write two handbook chapters back to back, I made the other one focus much more on methods. So the one on field experiments in education in developing countries is a bit more of a toolkit, a practical toolkit for people who are interested in experiments. Okay, so if I had more time, I would have easily spent half a lecture or one lecture just talking about field experiments, given that there's been this explosion of randomized experiments in RCTs in education. And there's many reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that education is a particularly modular subject. So it becomes more feasible to intervene at the level of schools, at the level of classrooms, and sometimes at the level of students. So which means it's much more feasible to randomize education interventions than, say, monetary policy or things at a macro level. And also, given that developing countries typically don't have the resources to scale up overnight, it's much more natural to think about a scaled up approach to government programs. And so RCTs have been particularly prevalent in education. So I do recommend you go read that handbook chapter as a methodological aside. Okay, so let's jump into just some very, very simple facts. I think, again, Isaac did this. I'm just showing you in like 30 seconds. So this is a remarkable picture. Okay, it's a remarkable picture because basically it's showing you that, for almost every other outcome in the world, there is a strong correlation with per capita income. Okay, so this is from that handbook chapter, right? So the x-axis is log GDP per capita. Y-axis is gross enrollment rates. And basically, there is no gradient. There is no income gradient in enrollment, okay? But of course, as Isaac showed you, there is a clear income gradient in learning outcomes, okay? So at one level, this is not surprising. This is not surprising because richer countries not only have more resources in their school systems, but they also have more educated parents, okay? And a big part of what determines child human capital is parental inputs. And so it's not at all surprising that richer countries would do better, okay, in terms of learning outcomes. Okay, so that per se is not that surprising. So if you put these, and you see the same thing in math, you see the same thing in reading. And so the implications is that the glass half empty view is that the enrollment is not translating into learning outcomes. But the glass half full view is that low income countries are performing as expected in learning outcomes, right? For the reasons I mentioned, that, this includes parental inputs and a variety of other and quality of school inputs and a variety of other system level factors. Okay, so you could say that it's not surprising that they're on the income outcome gradient, okay, but they're outperforming on enrollment. So some historical perspective that, the US had a GDP per capita of about $2,500 in 1830, which is about the same as the PPP adjusted figures in sub-Saharan Africa. And, primary enrollment rate at that time was 55% and secondary was 1%. Okay, so compared to those standards, the developing countries today are doing much, much, much better in terms of understanding the importance of education and putting the public resources in to make sure that a lot more children have a chance to be in school. Okay, so in that sense, it's similar to Angus Deaton documenting kind of the shifting of the Preston curve over time, that life expectancy in low-income countries today is much higher than in OECD countries at a comparable level of GDP per capita. And in health, there's obviously medical innovation, public health, and a bunch of other things that allow you to do a lot better. In education, you've got similar success on enrollment, but not on learning. Okay, so why am I giving you this background? Because to me, I find this a really useful way of motivating everything we're going to talk about for the rest of this lecture today and tomorrow, is that if you are if you care intrinsically about education, okay, so you say, listen, I can't afford to wait for people to get rich. I really care about education as a human right, okay? And when you look at this picture, there's really three ways to proceed, okay? The first is you could look at this x-axis and say that, listen, if I get countries growing faster, okay, then over time, the difference between a Chinese growth rate and an Indian growth rate, say 2% extra over 30 years, is going to lead to a doubling or tripling, like mean of differences in GDP per capita. And that by itself is going to give you improvements in human capital. And that's the first order thing that we should focus on, okay? Now, the second view is you can look at this picture and saying, okay, this is a broad income outcome kind of correlation, but let's look at positive outliers, okay? So what stands out here, it's Vietnam, okay, which dramatically outperforms what you would expect at its per capita level of income, okay? And so you could go and say, let's go study the Vietnamese education system. Let's understand what they're doing better and see what of this we can replicate in other education systems, okay? And I think that's a very useful exercise. And Abhijit Singh has this very nice paper, in fact, documenting with comparable panel data across countries that the productivity of the Vietnamese education system is in fact meaningfully higher than other comparative countries. The problem is that sometimes if you look at these big outliers, they tend to be places like Vietnam, Cuba, Kerala, right? The Indian state of Kerala. And the problem is that these were also communist countries, right? I mean, and so historically, that means, communist societies have been different in many, many ways, not just their education systems. And in many ways, education systems tend to mirror the structure of social equality and inequality, okay? So the point is that it may not be possible to achieve everything there without also looking at the larger socioeconomic kind of systems, okay? So what is then the third approach? The third approach, which is what I'm going to focus on the bulk of today and tomorrow, is that at any given level of GDP per capita, okay, there is staggering variation in the cost effectiveness of what governments do for education policy, okay? So there are things that you spend enormous amounts of money on that end up having no impact, as shown up by the research. And there are things you do that's remarkably inexpensive that could be much, much, really effective, right? So if you're a resource constrained poor country, and if you're able to move your money, right, public funding from the things that are not so cost effective to the things that are more cost effective, then at any given level of GDP per capita, you're going to be able to deliver a lot more education, okay? And then you could kickstart a virtuous cycle, because obviously this picture is just a correlation, right? Because income matters for education, but education also matters for income, okay? So if you can improve the functioning of your education systems and get kind of, start moving above this line prediction, and essentially start becoming more and more of a positive outlier, which is possible based on the research, then you're both intrinsically improving kind of human development, and you're instrumentally going to help your growth process, because then that increased human capital may then come back and give you a little bit of additional tailwinds, okay, when it comes to your growth process, okay? So before we delve into the micro of, improving the functioning of education systems, I'd like to keep this big picture view about, where are we going with all of this, okay? And the goal is that you can start delivering substantially better outcomes even at a given level of GDP per capita and a given level of public spending, okay? And this is particularly important because, again, we're not going to talk about tax and tax capacity, okay? But there's a lot of education advocates around the world who will say, OECD standards of education spending are 6% for GDP, and so India should do that, and my favorite low-income country should do that. The problem is that what they don't realize is that the tax to GDP ratio in India is about 18% compared to about 35 to 40% in the OECD countries, okay? So the norm of 6% that seems to be sitting in this international education community often reflects a tax to GDP ratio that's kind of simply not realistic given the higher level of informality in developing countries, okay? So given that you're working on a much lower base of public resources, the imperative of cost effectiveness, it's not just an economic imperative, it really is a moral imperative, as you'll see how much, variation there is in the cost effectiveness of what we do, okay? So that's kind of the big picture. And what we're going to talk about today is school governance. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to get to the last bullet. But fortunately, I have another lecture, so I can spill over a little bit tomorrow. But the main thing we're going to focus for the most part is teachers, okay? And the reason we're focusing so much on teachers is in most developing country education systems, teacher salaries really account for 80 to 90% of your non-capital spending. And sometimes, if you take the depreciated annualized amount of capital spending, teacher salaries is still about 70, 75%, okay? So that's kind of where the big expenditure is. And so if you care about improving the effectiveness of education systems, focusing on teachers is kind of your logical first first point. And then tomorrow, I'll also talk about pedagogy, right? But in the context of technology. Okay, so any questions before I go forward? Am I seeing anything? Okay.
We don't have any questions yet, but just as a reminder, everyone, to please submit your questions via the Q&A box.
Excellent. All right. Okay. So onward hope. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about, which again may have been mentioned, and I'm not fully sure, is just the fact that there's been multiple studies that find large amounts of teacher absence in developing countries. Okay, so this was actually my first major research paper done as a PhD student, and I was an RA on this project after the first year of my PhD. So for the PhD students here, find ways to RA with your professors, right? I mean, and over time, that's how you kind of learn the craft of doing research. But this was kind of conducted as part of the World Development Report 2004 on making services work for the poor. Okay, now, and the reason we picked provider absence as a metric is that this was an easily comparable metric of governance across countries. We didn't have standardized data on learning outcomes. This was before Young Lives, before more attempts to put together cross-country education data sets. And so we just picked absence as a very simple measure. And the way this was, it was anecdotally reported as a problem. And so the aim was to collect systematic data. So it's very simple, large representative random samples. You make surprise visits to the schools. You have a roster, collect a roster of all the staff who are posted there. And then you just measure, was this person there at this time of kind of random visit during the school day, okay? And so the headline result in that paper was that the average absence across these sample of 6 countries at that time was about 19%. But countries like India and Uganda had, over 25%. And there was a strong income gradient, which I'll show. In health, this was in fact higher, 35% overall and about 40% in India, okay? But the more important fact I want to call your attention to is this very robust negative correlation between GDP per capita and the level of absence, okay? So on the left-hand side, each triangle is a country, each dot is an Indian state, which is larger than most, typical Indian states are larger than most countries. And so what you see is this very robust relationship, okay? So even in India, there's huge variation. There's states with absence as low as 15%, the states with absence in 42%. And the reason I'm kind of highlighting this negative correlation with income is if you remember that positive correlation between GDP per capita and learning outcomes, what it suggests is that richer countries are doing a combination of things differently, right? That they're going to spend more money, they're going to have more inputs, but richer countries, what this picture shows is that they also probably have better governance of their education systems, okay? So I think Isaac talked about education production functions. So in that production function, there's not just a set of inputs, but there's also usually an A, which is kind of the TFP, right? There's the productivity parameter, and you could think about that productivity as reflecting aspects of governance as well as how you're using your inputs, okay? And so what this picture tells me, and I'll show you this in a management slide at the beginning of next lecture, okay, is that there is a robust kind of cross-country correlation between GDP per capita and measures of governance or management quality, okay? So, and this also highlights a little bit of a challenge for, say, the global aid community, or even if you're the government of India and trying to allocate money across states. And the problem is that the places that need the money the most are also the places with the weakest governance, okay? Which means that the translation of resources into outcomes is going to be weaker in the places that need it the most. And that's why getting governance right is kind of such a first order issue for improving the quality of public expenditure, okay? So that was based on fieldwork done in 2003. And then in 2010, we went back and did a panel study, right? This is focused in India, and we resurveyed the same villages. So we went back to the same about 1,500 villages across 19 states. And the idea was this was a period of massive increases in public education spending. So you had this universal education campaign called Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. And that period had seen this big increase in spending. So we were like, this is a good time to go back and just see what these changes are. Because obviously, while a bunch of other studies were randomized, you can't really randomize across the whole country. So then a better way, because back in the 2003 data, that was just a correlation, right? So there's tons of omitted variables, but with panel data, you can look at everything with village fixed effects. So you're taking out kind of common unobserved variation over time, and then just kind of looking at the differences in a variety of inputs as well as teacher absence, okay? So what we find is that consistent with the policy idea that equated quality with inputs, that you found a substantial improvement in almost every measure of school inputs. Okay, so the fraction of schools with running water, with functioning toilets, with the library, with electricity, they all went up. Okay, school feeding programs. So some of these indicators doubled, some of them quadrupled. Teacher training went up, teacher education had gone up. So, in every way, the system was doing what it set out to do. Okay, so that's kind of the glass half full story, which is the Indian government, like many other governments, really made serious commitments to education for all and put the money behind it. And so this is then the success story. Okay, but the less good news is that there was much less impact on teacher absence. Okay, so in the rural areas, it was 26.2%, and that fell by about 2.6% to 23.6. Okay, now what's interesting is that just like there's a production function for education, there's also a production function for governance. Okay, so I can put absence on the left-hand side and look at what are all the correlates of absence. And what you see is that some of these inputs do matter. Okay, so the working conditions, like I think back in the 2006 paper in the correlations, we had found, right, that better facilities and stuff were associated with lower absence, suggesting that maybe these matter for working conditions. Okay, now, but basically we find that if you put this on that income trajectory, right? So in the 2003 data, we can estimate a cross-sectional elasticity of what would be the impact of a 1% increase in GDP on teacher absence, right? So you've got, if you remember this, you can estimate that correlation, the income absence gradient, okay? And so what's interesting is that the reduction in absence that we estimate from 2003 to 2010 is exactly in that same line of that income outcome prediction line. But there's no increase in the TFP, right? So there hasn't been an increase in the productivity with regard to reducing teacher absence, okay? So which is again consistent with the fact that most of what you see in education globally is driven by input increase. But what we're going to show you is that there's huge potential for increasing the TFP of your education system. Okay, and so what we estimate is that just the fiscal cost of teacher absence alone is, over 10,000 crore rupees a year. This is in 2010 salaries. Okay, so in PPP terms, that's close to $5 billion a year that is being lost just for teacher absence. Okay, and so this is conservatively measured because we're taking out like an 8 to 10% allowance for leaves and other potentially legitimate absence. So even just looking at at kind of what's a reasonable measure of unauthorized absence, you end up with very, very large fiscal costs. Okay, so this again highlights why focusing on teachers does make sense if you're coming at this from both from a public finance perspective, as well as the perspective of the most important input into education is the teacher in the classroom. Okay, now, what can we say about how might you reduce absence? Okay, so one logical thing you might think about is improving school governance, right? And so in our correlational data, the only robust predictor of lower absence, and this is now panel data, right, was increased frequency of monitoring. Okay, so a school that had been visited or inspected by a senior official in the last 3 months. So we made 3 different visits. And so if the probability of kind of being inspected the last 3 months was 1, that means you have been visited by somebody in the 2 to 3 months, in the 3 months before the visit, in every visit, compared to a school that had not gotten any such visits, the difference in absence was about 6 to 8 percentage points, which is over a third of the absence, right? I mean, in an accounting sense, was being explained by kind of just a variation in supervision. Okay, and that holds with and without controls, with state and district fixed effects. So it is a pretty robust relationship. Okay, so basically the big driver of this ends up just being staffing. Okay, so there's variation in staffing, there's variation in the beat, and so that's a big driver of the variation in supervision. But what we find is that there's also large vacancies and short tenures among managerial staff. Okay, so about 20% of district officials, 32% of block education officials were just the positions were vacant, and in many cases they would get transferred every year. And so the quality of management and supervision was remarkably weak. Okay, so I'll talk more about that, but this is just like one metric of management quality. Okay, so from a policy perspective, what we care about is effective student-teacher ratio, right? How much time does a student get with the teacher? And there's 2 ways of doing this. The one way to do this is to hire more teachers, and that reduces class size. Or I could reduce the absence rate of the existing teachers, and that will also improve the effective student-teacher ratio, okay? And what we're able to show using the estimates in the paper is that it would be about 10 to 12 times more cost effective to fill the supervisory vacancies than it is to hire additional teachers. So you can just make some assumptions about how many schools a given supervisor can cover. And even with very conservative assumptions, it ends up being that investing in that governance and state capacity would be about 10 to 12 times more cost effective. And that, in fact, is a number that seems to be showing up across sectors. Okay, so we're seeing that number in early childhood development. We're seeing that number in delivery of welfare programs. So, and this is one of the reasons I'm writing my first book on state capacity, which will hopefully be out by the end of this year. But it's really tying the threads across a lot of this body of evidence across sectors about the central importance of kind of investing in better systems and public and public capacity. Okay. Now, the other way in which you could improve governance and monitoring would be through bottom-up monitoring. Okay. So what you're getting here is top-down. And so a big part of the right to education and earlier thinking on school governance around the world has been that you need to get communities more engaged. Okay. So in India, there's these village education committees or school management committees. And so in this panel data, we find no impact. Okay, so there's no impact on the existence, no impact on their activity. So it suggests that these VECs were not that effective. And that's consistent with an experimental study, right, that is also on your reading list. So it's called Pitfalls of Participatory Governance. So this is another paper that Esther, Abhijit, Stuti, and I think Rachel, right, did in Uttar Pradesh working with Pratham, where they were looking at ways of strengthening the functioning of the village education committee, including providing more information, giving people a sense of their rights and what are their, that by the law, the VEC is authorized to go and hold the teacher accountable in some ways. Okay. But basically, they find very close to zero impact. I think, if I'm not mistaken, less than 10% of people even knew about the VEC or some shocking statistic like that in the baseline. Okay. And so the likely reasons for this include that there's massive power asymmetry between the teachers and the communities. And that's because the teachers are by far the most educated person, and they tend to be civil service employees who have, permanent jobs. Okay. So both in terms of a socioeconomic kind of distance, as well as just sheer power, right? They are way, way above the hierarchy, and it makes it much harder for these school management committees to do anything. And so there's an interesting contrast, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about school management committees and contract teachers, is that Esther, Pascaline, and Michael have the study in Kenya where they show that strengthening school committees did have an impact, but only on the contract teachers, okay? And the contract teachers, and we'll spend a fair bit of time on that, are teachers who are appointed by the community as opposed to higher levels being civil service employees, okay? So one likely reason for that is power asymmetry. But then there's also collective action problems, right? Which is obviously everybody's busy, and anybody who's been part of a PTA knows this, right? That you want other parents to be engaged, but it is hard to get everybody to show up, okay? And so that's also very similar. And again, this has nothing to do with education, but just tying the threads across different bodies of evidence. So Ben Olken's famous corruption paper in 2007 did a very similar study experimentally looking at top-down monitoring versus bottom-up, and found again that the top-down monitoring was much more effective. Okay, so again, this is not to suggest that the community control can never matter. It's community interventions can never matter. It's just that the reality of life in most developing countries is that there's massive power asymmetries, okay, which make that channel a little harder to make work in practice. Okay, all right. So let me pause for questions.
Okay, we have one question from Balu Pade. He's asking if the schools in the study were all government schools. Were there any private schools in the sample?
So the original absence study, it covered private schools as well, but these figures that I'm reporting are for public schools only. And yeah, the private school absences were a little lower, but then because there's so many differential selection issues about the kind of children who go to private schools, this paper for the most part focuses on public, and the private schools we study separately in voucher studies, which I won't talk about, but Asim or Jishnu will talk about next week.
Second question. From Sahid Bello, have you explored the source of teacher absence?
Yes, so I think so basically one common trope is that a lot of the absence is driven by other non-teaching duties, right? The teachers are sent off on election duties, they're sent off for censuses, they're sent off for a bunch of other administrative tasks. But what we find is by teachers' own self-reports that once you account for these days, that's less than 1% of the total days or less than 4% of the total absence. Okay, so so the bulk of the absence seems to be, just anecdotally driven by the fact that the teachers, the civil service teachers, actually live really far from the communities. Okay, so the average distance is about 12 to 15 kilometers, and so they are often commuting to the village, right? So you could imagine that there could be anything from from the bus not showing up to having other things come up, right? It's just that they're very far from the community, so the marginal cost of getting to school is much higher. Now that's one reason. There's obviously other reasons, but the fact that the monitoring result shows up so strongly suggests that the weak governance and oversight is also like a key driver. So again, it's not like absence is like widespread and prevalent, right? 75% of the teachers do show up, and in fact, if you look at the difference across teachers, you can't reject that the absence is broadly distributed as opposed to concentrated in a few bad eggs, okay? And so what that suggests is that overall, there's just a systemic level of acceptance of a certain amount of absence, and that's, broadly what's driving it. But proximately, I would say governance and distance are probably two of the big drivers.
Another question from Padmaja Ayagari. Is absence among the school inspectors also a concern?
No, exactly, right? I mean, so there's always this question then of who monitors the monitors, right? And so what's the guarantee that just hiring additional staff will do that for you? Okay, so absolutely, okay. And I think the way to think about this is, like I said, if 75% of the time they are showing up, right, that does have some effect. Okay, so as we'll see later in Esther's paper on teacher incentives, it's not like, they don't do work. I mean, they do, right? It's just that there's slack in the system. Okay, so you shouldn't think about this as saying, oh, everybody's kind of, just a truant and not working. I mean, there is a reasonable amount of effort. It's just that there's also a fair bit of slack in the system, and that's kind of how you should think about this. Okay, so that's 3. So I'll move on unless there was any other pressing question.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, excellent. All right. So so the title of this lecture was initially going to be called teacher incentives, and that's the topic I'm going to spend the most time on. Okay, but I've called it governance more broadly because the incentives is just one part of governance. Okay, but basically the field interactions with teachers showed that they were often demotivated, right, in part because there was nothing in their professional lives that depended on performance. The correlations, in fact, suggested that there's no link between the level of teacher pay and their value addition. So Isaac's already talked about value addition, and this has also been shown recently in Pakistan. So there's just there's no correlation between levels. And so it really, Econ 101 would suggest that rather than thinking about the level of pay, that we may be better off thinking about the structure of pay, right? So what happens if some component of your pay depends on measures of performance? Okay, and so there was promising evidence from Israel, which is, I guess, a middle-income country, not quite developing country, but not quite OECD either. And so Victor Lavie had multiple papers showing significant positive impacts of learning outcomes from both natural and randomized experiments with teacher performance pay. Okay. And so following the absence work, I think as economists, and it's funny, even as a person who's worked in incentives, I now almost think that we do too much work on incentives. And that's because economists get excited by incentives when in fact, perhaps the most important things to do for developing country education at this point are get into the classroom and understand pedagogy better. But, back then there weren't really that many studies on incentives. So you can see why everybody got excited and people continue to be excited. So there's an ongoing active literature on teacher incentives. Okay. There's 3 papers broadly of that same vintage, okay, that all looked at teacher incentives. There's my paper, which was in fact my job market paper when I was doing my PhD. There's Esther, Rimahana, and Steve Ryan's paper, which also I'll talk about. And then there's another paper by Michael and Paul Levy and Norman Elias in Kenya. Okay, so let's. So the paper I'm going to do a deep dive on is my paper, which I put a double star on. And so, it also gives you a little bit of a flavor of why it's kind of fun to do RCTs. And that's because you get to design the experiment from the beginning to answer a very comprehensive set of questions. Okay, so the basic question is, does teacher performance pay improve test scores? And there's reasons to think it may not, which I'll talk about. And then the bigger concern is often the possibility of negative consequences. And I'll talk about that in the context of broader theory of multitasking. Then there's questions about group versus individual incentives. Should you do this for the whole school or should you do this for individual teachers? There's questions of how would teacher behavior change? Getting into the black box of this. There's a question of cost effectiveness. There's a question of political viability and how teachers would respond. Okay, so So first of all, it's not obvious, right? I mean, that providing incentives would have an impact. So there's a large literature in psychology and economics on the possibility of financial incentives crowding out intrinsic motivation. Okay, so and I'm not going to have time to talk about all of that, but it's certainly something that behavioral people worry a lot about. But the context actually suggests that the lack of differentiation between high and low performing teachers was also a problem. Okay, so one of our correlations in the data is that the teachers who report higher job satisfaction were in fact the ones who were the more absent. Okay, and which in a way makes no sense. You think, the most motivated, committed people have high job satisfaction and they show up. But what this likely suggests is that the teachers who could get away without showing up were quite satisfied with their jobs, and the people who were showing up were feeling rather kind of disgruntled at kind of, being the ones who are hardworking without any actual recognition. Okay, so so the flip side of the behavioral economics literature is that it also shows that the lack of external reinforcement could reduce intrinsic motivation. Okay, so taking my own example, when I went from the private sector to academia, I probably took an 80% cut in lifetime income. Okay, so there is intrinsic motivation in kind of doing what I do. But even I respond to incentives in the sense that if there's a deadline or somebody I respect is going to read a paper, right? I mean, that if there was no external stimulus at all, then over time that would also crowd out intrinsic motivation. You're like, why bother? Okay, so just because this is a profession that people associate with kind of being noble motivations, that doesn't mean that you don't need kind of reinforcement. And often external reinforcement, lack of that reinforcement over time can in fact erode intrinsic motivation. Okay, so what that suggested, of course, was that the framing matters. And so it was important to kind of frame the whole program less in terms of accountability, which is an adversarial framing, and more in terms of recognition of excellent teaching. Okay, so sorry, I think. All right. So in fact, I think I'd meant to drop that slide in the interest of time, but it showed up. Okay. But anyway, so that was the first bullet. But I think as economists, the much bigger concern is that even those who think that incentives can improve test scores, okay, worry about distortions to behavior. So the idea of teaching to the test is kind of the classic example of Holmstrom-Milgram's multitasking model, which I'll talk about. I'll give you a theoretical sketch of the core ideas. But the basic idea is that you can put an incentive contract only on things that you measure, but not on the things you don't measure, and that can lead to a lot of suboptimal distortion of activity. Okay, so there's are you just doing test prep? Are you manipulating the test taking population? And so this is in the context of No Child Left Behind in the US in the early 2000s, where a lot of high stakes incentives were put in place in the education system. So a lot of work in the US had documented different ways in which teachers were gaming the incentive system, okay? Manipulating the test taking population. There was even a study that showed that on the day of the test, like schools and teachers make sure the kids are better fed, and there's outright cheating, okay? So all of these are examples of multitasking. So the classic papers are Holmstrom-Milgram, and then George Baker has variants of that, which are also quite useful. So, but I think what it doesn't quite recognize is, and I put this theory paper in the reading list. And so it's a very simple applied theory paper, but it's very, very insightful about the core structure of this problem, okay, which is that imagine I'm a professor and you guys are all in my class at the end of a quarter, end of a semester. My goal is to maximize human capital, okay? So I want to maximize how much you learn. And there are two options I can take. I can say that at the end of this quarter, here's 30 papers that really matter, and I'm going to test you on this in the final exam. Or I can say, here is 500 papers, okay, that you should know, and I could test you on any of those 500. So the question for you is, which of these two models of telling you to focus on 30 papers versus kind of saying anything is fair game, here's 500 papers, which of those is going to give you more human capital, okay? And you can obviously immediately see the answer is not obvious, okay? There are people who are going to say, wait, the 30 papers is better because with 500, I'm just going to be like a deer in the headlights and have no idea where to focus, okay? And the basic insight is that students will study for an exam if the benefit of studying exceeds the cost, okay? And the benefit of studying is the probability that it shows up on the exam, okay? So when I give you 30 questions, the benefit of studying is 1 over 30. When I give you 500, the benefit of studying any given is 1 over 500, okay? And you can see that there's going to be many students for whom the cost is such that it's not going to make sense at 500, but it will make sense at 30, okay? But now, what is the cost of this approach? The cost of this approach is there may well be students who are absorbing material much faster, who would have studied much more if you gave them 500, okay? But if you give them only 30, they might say, hey, 30 and I'm done, okay? So basically, you can already see that a policy like saying focus on 30 questions is going to give you different impacts for at different parts of the learning distribution. Okay, so for people who are high cost learners, narrowing the curriculum can actually get you more learning. For people who are low cost learners who would otherwise study a lot more, narrowing it can reduce the amount you study. Okay. And so, and I'll talk more about this next time also. And Esther talked about this in terms of the tyranny of the curriculum, right? About at what level of instruction are we prioritizing? And one of the sources of, I think, just cognitive disconnect in many education systems is that the people who are kind of the educators, the teachers, the professors, we are all kind of in the right tail of the cognitive distribution who did well in school. So we enjoyed studying, right? I mean, that's kind of why we're doing what we do. And so, which means that there's this, I think, instinctive overweighting, right? I mean, of people with low cost of studying, right? Whereas if you think about your average population for whom studying is actually really quite painful, right? That if you were to narrow down the scope of what people had to do, you might actually get substantially more learning. Okay, so you could think about the teaching to the test debate as a variant of exactly that, right? That the people who oppose it tend to be teachers and educators who, and it's rational, right? Because you do like to read a lot and you want your own kids to be exposed to a lot of material and you think that that's what is good education. But in fact, for a lot of kids who are, say, first generation learners, but and who have very high costs of learning, that you may get much more human capital, right? Like, by narrowing the scale and scope of what they did. So again, like Esther said, you can't do nuclear physics, right? Like, if you can't read and count, okay? And the curriculum and the syllabi look a lot like that. They're often very challenging, partly with the view of saying we need to set high standards, but is suboptimal for large parts of the distribution. Okay, so the conceptual sketch is very simple, and I think one of the other reasons why incentives papers tend to get published very well is that they're really a much more broader problem in economics more generally, right? It shows up in principal agent modeling. It shows up in economics of the firm and personnel economics. It's much broader than just schools. Okay, and the basic problem is that the social planner cares about human capital, but can only write a contract based on test scores. Okay, so imagine you're a teacher. You can take three different types of actions. Okay, so there's good actions, there's neutral actions, and there's bad actions. Sorry, that last guy down here should be an AB. Sorry about that. Okay. But the good actions are actions that are teaching, okay, and really creating human capital, okay? Neutral actions may be things like test-taking skills, okay? Teaching kids how to guess, teaching them how to eliminate options. So it's neutral because it's not really human capital, but it's not hurting you either, right? It's teaching how to do the test better. And then there's bad actions you could take, and the bad actions are things like cheating, okay? Or things like getting kids to drop out, the weak kids to drop out to push up your average, okay? And Isaac talked a little bit about this as well. And so the challenge for the social planner is that the marginal product of these different actions. So if I look at how these three kind of actions contribute to test scores, they're all positive, right? I mean, because test scores can improve by teaching you, they can improve by teaching you how to take tests, they can improve by cheating, okay? But from the perspective of human capital, the first one is good, the second one is neutral, and the third one is actually bad, okay? So a key insight in this literature is that if you assume that teachers have a minimum level of effort they put in, okay, call that A star, below which they get intrinsic disutility, and if you assume that if I don't have high-powered incentives, then I will allocate my given level of effort to the good effort, okay? Because I don't have an incentive to do something bad. So then my default, my tie-breaking condition is to do the right thing, okay? So in such a condition, it may be optimal to not offer any incentive on the test scores. Okay, so and that's the key Holmstrom-Milgram insight, and they use that to explain why in many professions you actually don't see any incentives, and that's basically because the unmeasured aspects are more important than the measured aspects. And if I put the incentive on the measured aspect, then I'm going to divert effort away from the unmeasured aspect to the measured aspect. Okay, now. But then what you see is if you look more carefully, what you'll see is that the risk of unintended consequences does not naturally imply that the optimal incentive is zero. And in particular, if you can design things to rule out some of these bad actions, and if you can mitigate many of the concerns by design, you can, in fact, do better by having some kind of incentives. Okay, so a lot of what I was spending my time doing in this paper is not just saying, hey, I've gone to the field and seen the teachers are absent. How do we kind of design, some kind of incentives? It was really kind of grappling with this theoretical literature and saying, here's all of the pathologies of incentives that have been identified. And so how do you design something, okay, that will basically mitigate the negatives and increases the chances that you get positive. Okay, so I discuss a lot of this in the paper, but very quickly, like I said, the intrinsic motivation is addressed by framing. The teaching to the test is is basically addressed in this setting, okay, by designing the test. So we hired one of India's leading education companies, and we'll see them when we talk about MindSpark next lecture. It's the same company. And so we designed these tests to have what we call both mechanical versus conceptual questions. And so the idea of the mechanical questions is this would resemble rote learning. And the conceptual ones is taking the same underlying idea, but asking it in an unfamiliar way, okay, so that you cannot do well on the test without some deeper understanding as well, okay? And in any case, like I said, going back to the Lazier point, as well as what Esther was saying, that even if what you're getting is teaching to the test, okay, it's much less of a concern if what I'm teaching is basic literacy and numeracy, okay? And even if this leads to kids getting a little bit more practice, there's research that shows that the process of taking a test itself can enhance learning because it forces you, and we'll see a little bit of that in high stakes versus low stakes testing, okay? And then there's a concern about threshold effects. So the reason I'm spending so much time on this is when you look at the evidence on performance pay, often people would summarize this by saying, oh, some studies work, some studies don't, okay? And what I want to tell you is that that's really not the right way to look at this literature. And you'll see the same thing in ed tech next lecture, that some ed tech interventions work, some don't, okay? So it's easy to just say, hey, it's a mixed bag. No, the real lesson of that is that the details of the design of the intervention really, really matter. Okay, so that's going to matter for incentives. It's going to matter for ed tech, and and one of the things a lot of the early incentive programs are doing was basically having threshold effects, okay, and saying that you get a bonus if kids score above a certain amount. And what that's going to do is, if you look at the distribution of learning outcomes, you'll see that for the kids who are already above, the teacher has no incentive to work harder. For the kids who are so far behind that you're not going to make the threshold, there's no incentive. And so that gives you incentives to focus on a narrow range of kids, okay? So that's why you want to design this in a way that you're rewarding improvements of kids at every part of the distribution. So we did this based on averages. And then there's a much there's a theory paper by Derek Neal and Gary Barlevy in the AER, which I put in your reading list, which kind of really gets into this issue of optimal design of these incentive contracts. Okay, so the design itself is a highly non-trivial theoretical problem. So we paid attention to a bunch of these things and came up with a set of solutions that, was addressing the problem, but was not designed to theoretically be the first best. And that's what the Barlevy-Neal paper did. Okay, and then cheating. And again, so there's a reason why, despite the positive evidence, like I have still never recommended this as policy, mainly because, at scale, you would not be able to rule out just data integrity issues. And that's why I'm going to spend time talking about this Abhijit Singh data integrity paper tomorrow, which you should skim if possible. But for the study, this was done by independent teams from one of India's leading nonprofits, who was a key partner in running the study. Okay, so I'm just spending that time on design because it's easy to just show you treatment effects and say it worked. Okay, but the real thinking in a paper like this goes in the design, and because once you've gotten the design right, then the estimation and inference is relatively straightforward. Okay, so the main results here was that the incentives had substantial positive effects. Okay, so at the end of 2 years, you got about 0.22 standard deviations across subjects, about 0.28 on math, 0.16 on language. So these are pretty sizable effects. Okay. And then if you look at the distribution, this is quantile treatment effects plotting the distribution by the end-line percentile of the end-line score. And you see that the incentive distribution, which is this guy up here, first order stochastically, dominates the control group. So which means kids are better off at every percentile of the achievement distribution. Okay. Now, you can also do this by the baseline score, okay, which is this guy. And again, in education research, I'm a huge fan of doing non-parametric tests of heterogeneity because sometimes there might be funky nonlinearities. But it also, you have enough data and you can use the baseline score as a summary statistic of all of the prior inputs that the kid has had up to that point, and you can just trace out impacts at different parts of the distribution. Okay, so what this is showing us is that for kids at every part of the baseline test score distribution, you find significant positive effects. Okay. Now, one little puzzle here was that if you look at this picture, it looks like the variance has gone up in the treatment distribution, right? Because this gap is much larger than the gap over here. And that's true. But if you look here, it looks like all kids are benefiting roughly equally, okay? And it turns out that the reason for this is that, sorry, I took that up, okay? That there's a lot of heterogeneity by teacher characteristics, okay? So there's some teachers who respond a lot more than others. And so if you're if you're in the class of a teacher who responds a lot. So that's going to give you higher variance in the end line distribution, but it doesn't change kind of the heterogeneity by baseline distribution, and that's broad-based. Okay. So there's a bunch of heterogeneity I took out. There's one table I'm showing you because this is going to come back later in the complementarities paper. Okay. So if you look at the heterogeneous effects of which teachers respond differently to the teacher incentives, the one very interesting and robust result is that if you look at education and training, okay, which is what the system focuses on. So this is teachers' level of education. This is teachers' level of education training. So the way to read this is that the covariate is just kind of this characteristic in the controlled schools, and the interaction is that interacted with the incentive treatment. And so what you see is that the education and training does not seem to matter. The years of experience and the salary don't seem to matter. Okay, so in the value added specification in the control schools, basically none of these standard metrics of teacher kind of quality seem to matter. Okay, but if you look at the interaction, what this suggests is that the quality is a combination of knowledge and effort. Okay, so it suggests that having more education and training gives you the capacity to be a better teacher. But if my effort is low, then the translation of that knowledge into impact is very weak. Okay, so if I boost your effort, then that I'm going to get a higher impact from the teachers who are more educated and more trained. And this actually shows up very robustly even in the 5-year data. Okay, but column 3 and 4 then highlight the perils of this approach, which is essentially these are non-experimental. Okay, so if I were to look at column 4, because we were not able to randomize the amount of the incentives, so we're not able to estimate an elasticity of responses to the incentives. It's hard enough to randomize, and so we thought, okay, we can look at the interaction with the baseline salary. Okay, so what this tells you is that, as you would expect, that the teachers with the higher base pay respond less to the incentive program, all right, which is consistent with the magnitude of the incentives mattering, right? Because the incentive amount was constant, or the amount you could win was constant. Okay, so it wasn't differentiated by teacher. So if you had lower base pay to begin with, right, the incentives were a bigger part of your total comp. Okay. So that looks promising. The problem is that the biggest correlate of baseline salary is your years of experience, right? So it's also negative with years of experience. And so what that tells you is I cannot tease apart two stories, right? One where this is about the magnitude of the pay. The second is that younger teachers are more enthusiastic about changing their behavior, about responding to new programs, whereas older teachers, it's just harder for them to change behavior and they don't care as much, okay? So and so what this tells you is that when you do these heterogeneous effects, these covariates are not randomized. Okay, so that could be correlated with other things. So you can only treat these things as suggestive, and you shouldn't go too far in putting a causal interpretation on these guys. Okay. And so then kind of going fast, the mechanical and conceptual, right? So one of the things which, again, was just a lot of fun, right, as part of the pilots is, so here's an example of mechanical versus conceptual. Okay, so you can give the kids a question that says 37 times 4 equals what? And over half of them can't do this. But those who can do this will do this because they've memorized their tables. And you can see them do 4 sevens are 28, 8, you put the 2, and then they'll carry over, they'll say 148. Okay. But now if you ask the same question as 37 plus 37 plus 37 plus 37 equals 37 times what? Okay, now that's an easier question because you just have to count 4 and write 4, okay? But to do that, you need to know that the concept of multiplication is the same as that of repeated addition, okay? And you find that dramatically fewer kids get the second one right than the first one right, okay? So that's then an example of a conceptual question. There's others I can talk about. The other favorite story I had was area, right? You can give the kids a rectangle, a triangle, and a house where you put the same triangle on top of the same rectangle. And you'll find that less than 50% of the kids who can get the rectangle right and the triangle right will be able to get the house, okay? Even though they just have to add these two numbers that they've just calculated, okay? So, and then the nice thing about working with the test design company is that they also go and interview the kids to say, okay, so why aren't you able to do this? And the answer is they say, we don't know the formula, okay? So to them, area is when you see a rectangle, it's length times breadth, right? When you see a triangle, it's half base height. So you're just mechanically applying the formula without understanding that the concept of an area is something that's inside an enclosed polygon, okay? So basic or enclosed shape, right? So what we see here is that consistent with the idea that the basic and higher order skills in this case are complements and not substitutes, that you saw a significant improvement on both mechanical and conceptual questions, okay? And then the other thing we did was that the incentive itself was based only on maths and reading. sorry, and language. And so we also did a surprise test at the end of the first year on science and social studies. At the end of the second year, it was no longer a surprise, okay, but teachers credibly knew at the end of the first year that that test was not used in the bonus calculations in any way, okay? And what you see is also like a robust positive effect of being in an incentive school on these other subjects, okay? And so then we have some decompositions that kind of shows how this looks more like a spillover from improved reading, right, onto these other subjects, but that I won't have time to get into. And then in the first year, the group and the individual incentives are comparable. In the second year, the individual starts kind of doing better, okay? And over time, there's a long-term paper which is on my website, and over time, the individual starts kind of breaking away further and further from the group. Okay, so that's kind of that becomes more salient over time, but at the 2-year point, that difference was not significant. And then how did teacher behavior change? So, the one bad news from all of this stuff is, remember, we motivated this entire intervention from our study on teacher absence, okay? But the one thing that never changed was teacher absence. So despite the bonuses, despite the incentives, we find the teacher absence continues to be around 24%. But what you do see is when you interview the teachers about what did you do differently this year, okay? And this was completely unprompted, okay? As in, we didn't say, did you do homework or classwork? We just asked them, what did you do? And you see that a substantial fraction of them report extra homework, extra classwork, extra classes, and teaching beyond school hours, giving practice tests, and paying special attention to weaker kids, okay? And you can see that this is all highly, highly significant, and the rate is more than double, right? In the incentive schools. Now, of course, you might think this is just cheap talk. Why would they just not say this? And so there's 2 reasons why we don't think this is cheap talk. The first is none of these answers are above 50%. Okay, so if everybody felt they needed to say this, then this would be very high. And the second is you can correlate their response with the value adds, right? Because we know the value add of every teacher, and you see that these responses are in fact highly correlated with the value addition. Okay, so it suggests again that these were meaningful metrics of teacher effectiveness. Okay, so teacher effort went up, but teacher absence did not. Okay, and then when you compare with the inputs and the incentives, sorry, is there a chat? Is there a reminder? Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I am going very fast. Okay, but I believe there's a recording, and you can hear the lecture later at slow speed. Okay. So anyway, the incentives significantly outperform inputs of comparable value. Okay, and teachers also like the program. And there's going to be implications here for sorting, which I'll talk about in a bit. So one very interesting result is that we interview the teachers before they know their outcomes. And we asked them not just about do they like the program, because everybody likes more money, okay? But the way we asked the question was we asked them about their preferences over a mean preserving spread of pay, okay? We said, imagine there's a 15% budget for teacher pay increases, okay? And this can be allocated as either 15% across the board or 10% across the board, 10% based on performance, right? So the range could go from 10 to 20, a range from 5 to 25, a range from 0 to 30. And now what's really, really, really interesting is that now, of course, about 25% said, just give me the across the board hike. About 75% were willing to accept some performance-based spread. But what's super interesting is that the teachers who show the greatest support for performance pay ex ante in advance are also the ones who are most likely to have done better ex post. Okay, so what that tells you is that the effective teachers know who they are, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. Okay. And that would have implications for sorting, which are then these 2 very recent papers. One is Christina Brown's job market paper, and the other is by Claire Lever and all. And I'll talk about sorting in just a bit. Okay, so let me then quickly tell you about this other incentives paper that happened, which was Esther and Rima's Camera's paper. And so this was an RCT conducted in schools run by a nonprofit in Rajasthan. And now this kind of intervention would be much harder to pull off in public schools, because the public unions would kind of, would probably chase you out of the room. But because these were nonprofit schools, they were able to, and these are in remote locations, equip the teachers with a camera with a time and date stamp. Okay, and what the intervention did was change the wage schedule to reward attendance in treated schools. So the control schools had a flat wage of 1,000 rupees. The treated teachers had a base pay of 500 rupees if they attended up to 10 days, and they got an extra 50 for every day they attended above that. Okay, so if you attended, say, 26 days, you would make 1,300. So you could make more money by attending the full amount. Okay. And so you can see how that's kind of changing that incentive schedule, okay? And so what they find is large increases in teacher attendance, reduction in school closures, and also in learning outcomes. But they find no change in activity conditional on attendance, okay? Now, what's really interesting in contrasting these 2 papers is that as there are two margins of kind of effort, right? There's getting the teacher to the school, and then there's getting the teacher to work hard, conditional, and showing up. And theoretically, you could argue for pros and cons of either, okay? So the case for putting the incentives in attendance as opposed to test scores is if you think that there's not much multidimensionality in attendance, okay, that I'm not going to get more cheating, I'm not going to get more test prep, I'm not going to get like these bad things I may worry about. So let me at least get the teacher to school, and then once they show up, they may continue to slack a bit, but as long as they teach at least a little bit, I'm going to get more learning, okay? On the other hand, you might say that what I really care about is not attendance, but actually learning outcomes. And so let me kind of write the incentive contract on that. So what's interesting when you look at these two papers together is it reinforces your basic faith in economic theory, right? Because this paper incentivizes attendance and not test scores. So you get an increase in attendance, but no change in activity, conditional, and showing up. Our paper incentivizes learning outcomes, and so you don't get a change in attendance because remember, I told you part of what's driving absence is that teachers are living far away. So what that suggests is if the daily cost on a given day, the outside use of your time has gone up and you need to do something else, you end up doing that, but you make up when you show up, okay? So you put these two studies together, it just reinforces your basic faith in economic theory. And then one very interesting backstory about how this paper evolved is that the early drafts of this paper, right, were called monitoring works because I think everybody thought that the action was coming from the cameras, right, and the fact that you're being watched, okay? But as part of the, of the publication process, it kind of also became clear that the intervention was bundling two things. It was both doing measurement and it was doing incentives, okay? And so what they're able to do is use a structural model because there's a nonlinearity in the pay schedule to then tease apart how much of this impact is coming from the incentives versus the monitoring. And what they find is, in fact, the impact is mainly driven by the incentives and not the monitoring per se. And that's an important result because it tells you that just simply observing you is not going to change much unless there's actually something that happens as a result of that. Now, of course, the cameras and the measurement is still an integral part of the whole intervention, right? Because you cannot do the incentives without the measurement. But the point is that the measurement is an enabler, but the action is on the incentives, okay? So Econ 101 for the win, all right? And so that's what I just said, combined with that paper that I talked about in detail, it reinforces the importance of incentives. So I have 12 minutes left, right? So let me see if I can get to at least 2 or 3 more papers, right? So then there's this question about the complementarity with inputs, right? Knowledge, like I said, quality is a function of knowledge and effort. There's suggestive evidence of complementarities from that heterogeneity table. Okay, so then this is the paper that Isaac talked about, the grant side. And so what we do is just a large-scale RCT in Tanzania where you randomize the provision of school grants. And so in general, in talking to schools and teachers, this was most of my RCTs have been done in India where I know the context, and, the one study in Indonesia and one study in Tanzania had, local co-authors with a deep understanding of the local context. And so in this case, the local NGO that was leading the project, Tuweza, had done tons of focus group discussions, and the things that showed up again and again was low motivation and low resources. Okay, so again, what's motivating the intervention is the sense of these are the binding constraints as perceived by the practitioners in the system. So let's see if you can alleviate that and see the impact. Okay, so you've got this arm of offering school grants to alleviate the resource constraints, of teacher incentives to alleviate the motivation constraint, and both. Okay. And that 2x2 design ends up being important for testing complementarities. And so what we find is that there's no impact of the grants on their own, which Isaac talked about. There's modest impacts of incentives. And there's a sidebar here on high and low stakes testing, okay, which I'll talk about in a second. And then there's significant effects of both, right, which is much larger than the sum of the two. And that's kind of your textbook test of complementarities, right? That A plus B is more than A plus B, okay? Or rather A and B together, right? And so here's then the key table, which is, if you look at the first row is telling you the impacts of the school grants, and that's basically just 0, right? In math, in Swahili, in English, in a composite score, it's just not there, okay? Now, the incentives here are modest, right? And I'll come back and tell you why in just a second, okay? But the combination is always significant, right? I mean, and at the end of 2 years, if you look at this as kind of the headline number from the study, because this is a principal component aggregating across these 3 subjects, you see that these 2 guys are basically insignificant, but this combination is way bigger than the sum of these 2. Okay, so and kind of quantitatively, it's almost like 5 times the sum. All right, now So what that tells you is that in a very simple model, right, that the inputs can help, but in a business as usual setting, there's no motivation to use those inputs. But when I have motivation to use the inputs, I can do a lot more once I'm also given the resources. Okay. Now, the interesting question here is, why did this incentives not seem to work? Okay. And the reason here is that it turns out that this test, okay, that we did two different sets of tests over here, that there's a completely low stakes test, right, which is implemented on a sample basis by the nonprofit. And this is not the test that's used to pay the incentives, okay? And then there's another high stakes test, which is also, there's no cheating on this test, okay, because it's also done by the NGO, but this is the test on which the bonuses are being paid, okay? And so from the field, we already know that the day of the high stakes test was a much, much bigger deal. Okay. So principals and teachers and everybody, like, told their kids that this is important, like focus on this. They did prep focusing with that. Whereas these low stakes tests were done, the surveyors just showed up and randomly sampled 10 kids and kind of tested them. Whereas here, every kid was being tested and this is what the bonuses were being paid on. Okay. So and over here, what you see is that these incentives are in fact highly significant, and the combo continues to be, significantly higher than that. Okay. And so the reason this is important is for the complementarities result, we focus on the low stakes test because we did not do high stakes testing in the grants, right? Because there's no incentive. So you cannot, by construction, run a high stakes test, right? I mean, in the grants. So this becomes the main set of results for the complementarities result. But the reason we present this is for comparability with the existing literature. Okay, so if you looked at the performance pay paper that I just taught you about, in that one, the test that we did was also the test on which the incentives were paid. So again, there was no cheating because there was an independent assessment, but everybody was motivated to do that. Okay, so this kind of tells you that even the student motivation and teacher motivation on the test can make a substantial impact. And there's a paper by Sally Sadoff and others now documenting the importance of test-taking effort experimentally. Okay, so that's another aside in terms of interpreting these results. So then let's talk about the last piece, which is extensive margin, right? Which is there's a classic paper in performance pay by Ed Lazier in the context of a glass installing company. And what he shows is that when companies introduce performance pay, so remember, there's going to be a distribution of productivity in the population. And if I have a fixed pay, then the people who are above average are being undercompensated. The people who are below average are being overcompensated. Okay. So if I now have more of a spread in pay that reflects performance, the higher ability folks are going to be more attracted to professions that have more of a performance-based spread. Okay. So people and so what he shows is that over time, almost half of the benefits in that Safe Light Glass study, right, come from the extensive margin of sorting. So the intensive margin is, I'm already on the job, you're paying me more, you're giving me incentives. So do I work harder because I have more incentives to work? The selection margin is, over time, higher ability types are going to come into this profession because this is now a profession that also recognizes performance. Okay. And so that was obviously a big question that the early wave of RCTs had not done. And so this is giving you a sense of how studies get progressively more and more ambitious. Okay. And so now you've had two randomized controlled trials, both looking at kind of the selection margin, where they randomize the contracts, fixed wage versus performance pay, okay, at the time of teacher selection. And essentially what this first study finds is that there's positive but insignificant selection effects, and they find positive and significant intensive margin effects. Okay, so the overall effect continues to be positive, significant, and bolsters all of the existing evidence. And in that study, the selection effect was about 20%. And then there's a more recent paper. This is Christina Brown's job market paper. And it's a very similar goal, slightly different design, but implemented among private schools in Pakistan. Maybe the difference is that because the earlier paper was done in the context of public schools, maybe it doesn't, I think the advertisement was in the context of 2 years. And so maybe you don't get as much of a selection effect, whereas in private schools, it's a little bit more credible that you are going to do these differences over time. And so I'll show you some quick slides from the management paper later, showing you how the private school pay tends to be much more correlated with productivity. Okay, so, and that may be a reason why they find this paper finds much larger selection effects. Okay, and again, this earlier Safe Light Glass paper was also a private sector employer. So, obviously this is a conjecture, right? I'm not randomizing across who the nature of the employer is, but when I look at these studies and need to have an informed conjecture on what might explain the difference, This one, they're finding that the selection effects is almost the same effect, which is half of the total, which is exactly the Ed Lazier Safe Light Glass result. Okay, so what that suggests is that in the long term, performance pay matters not just for the intensive margin, but also for the extensive margin of selection. Okay, so let's do the last paper, and then I'll pick up the thread on contract teachers in the next lecture. Okay, so and this is now unconditional teacher pay increases. Sorry, give me 1 second. And so it's widely believed that low teacher pay is a leading reason for poor teacher performance. So almost every EFA, UNESCO global monitoring report will talk about low teacher pay. And so there's one argument that's on the extensive margin, that I need to pay more to attract better teachers. And there's a second, which is the intensive margin argument, okay? And the multiple narratives, there's gift exchange, different kinds of efficiency wave stories, okay? Bottom line is there's no evidence. But these salaries account for the bulk of the expenditure. Okay, so what we did in this paper in the QJE called Double for Nothing, so you can see where that ending is going, is we present evidence in the intensive margin of a permanent doubling of teacher pay. And so this is done in Indonesia using a large-scale experiment in the context of an actual policy by the government to double teacher pay. It's just that they announced that this would happen over 10 years. And in the experiment, we accelerated that doubling. So the teachers saw the doubling much faster, okay? So this is a really, really expensive policy. It's about $5 billion a year in steady state. And this is also giving you experimental evidence on public sector pay more generally. And in fact, a lot of what we know about public sector labor markets comes from education. And that's because it's really difficult to measure productivity in the public sector and very difficult to attribute productivity to an individual. Whereas in education, you can measure value added, right? So that's a measure of productivity, and you can map it to an individual teacher, okay? So that allows you to study public sector personnel economics really nicely in the context of education. Okay, so the bottom line is that and so what we show in the paper is also that now this experiment is not studying the extensive margin, right? We couldn't randomize the extensive margin. That's these other papers. But what we show is that because civil service pay is so high and nobody ever quits their job, okay, that to get the extensive margin benefits of selection of better teachers, you have to wait 30 to 40 years till everybody has retired and been replaced, okay? So once you do the present discounted value of this whole calculation, the bulk of the cost is on the intensive margin. So if today I announce an unconditional doubling of pay, in present value terms, about 75% of that cost is going to my incumbent teachers and not the new teachers who are going to come in over time, okay? So, and then there's this other paper studying the extensive margin of pay in the public sector. Okay, so the punchline is that the experiment worked remarkably smoothly, given that when you're doing this with the government, that's kind of the first big risk, okay? You get large first stage effects from the fraction of teachers who got the pay increase, and teachers really were very happy, okay? Increase in satisfaction, reduction in financial stress, reduction in holding second jobs, okay? And so all of this is consistent with the theory of change, except that we find absolutely no impact on test scores, okay? So these are very, very precise zeros, so you can rule out effects larger than 0.05 standard deviation, okay? So, but coming back to what I said about improving the cost effectiveness of public spending, the vast majority of education budgets in most countries go to unconditional pay increases for teachers, right? That's where the money goes. And that money is basically buying you nothing, okay, compared to, so here's in quantile treatment effects, you can't even after 2 years or 3 years even tell these distributions apart, that the treatment and control distributions, even though the treatment here got that doubling of teacher pay, there's literally no impact, okay? So again, it's one of these things that ex post is a little obvious to economists, right? Econ 101 is why would you change behavior if you don't change incentives? But, for good or for bad, policymakers are kind of basing on, not on evidence and based on gut that, pay will motivate people. But what the research shows in multiple studies, not just here, is that unconditional pay increases give you a modest kind of short-term bump, but it very quickly goes back to normal. Now, this is not true if there's a risk of being fired, okay? If there's a risk of being fired, then the efficiency wage kind of Shapiro-Stiglitz kicks in, because then you have a continuation payoff from keeping your job, and then the higher pay should get you higher effort. But in a permanent civil service job where there's zero probability being fired, that unconditional pay increase is just basically going straight from taxpayers into teacher pockets without giving you any impact on outcomes, okay? Again, now this is not to say that we shouldn't, treat teachers well. And there's other ways and aspects of doing this. But just to juxtapose these numbers, right? What we show is that an unconditional doubling of teacher pay gives you zero impact, whereas spending 3% of the budget on performance pay got you such massive impacts, okay? And in fact, the 3% is not even the true cost, because as I showed you, over time, you can do the pay in a budget neutral way, okay? So suppose you have a scheduled increase of pay of 10% every year for inflation and growth. Each year, you can take that 10% and saying, here's like 5% across the board, and the remaining 5% I'm going to put into a performance-based bonus pool. Okay, so the true long-term cost of performance pay is not the pay, but the measurement. Okay, so the measurement is what you have to pay, and that is the biggest problem. And so all of these studies have been done by third parties with independently measured stuff. Okay, so when I take stock of all of this, I think the evidence is remarkably clear that even modest amounts of teacher incentives do much, much better than unconditional pay increases, especially in low-income countries. But the reason you're not able to scale those things up is really the implementation challenge of the fidelity of the whole system. Okay, so I'll come back and talk a little bit about that. Now, if I can, I know Isaac went over, so if I can take 5 minutes, I would just love to finish contract teachers so then we can just not have one topic left over. And so, this is that whole paper in one picture. Okay, the first stage, you see this huge increase in the fraction of teachers paid more. Second stage, test scores, zero impact. So then the last topic I'll talk about is contract teachers. Okay, so one of the, as you had this large scale expansion of primary education in the 2000s, you had a huge problem in terms of hiring and deploying enough teachers. So there's a fiscal challenge, and there's also a logistical challenge, right? Which is the qualified teachers are less willing to be deployed to underserved areas. And often you just didn't have enough qualified teachers. So one very common response was to staff these positions with locally hired contract teachers, okay, who are not civil service employees. So one way of kind of asking the question based on the previous one is, if the doubling of the pay, right, doesn't get you impact, what would happen if I were to sharply cut pay? Now, of course, if you cut pay of an incumbent teacher, things will be very bad because then you have dramatic morale reductions, okay? But what happens if I just compare teachers with different pay structures? So the contract teachers have fixed term renewable contracts, so there's limited job security. They're typically less qualified and much less likely to be formally trained. And they're more likely to be from the local areas, and they're paid much lower salaries. Okay, so you can see why the contract teacher studies kind of touch on many of the themes we talked about, right? About accountability, about incentives. And so just to give you from, this is from my 2013 paper from that same overall project, just see how big these differences are. Okay, so the contract teachers are much more likely to be female. They're much more likely to be from the same village. Okay, 81% compared to 9%. So that early question about why are these regular teachers absent, because most of them live far away and have their own kids going to private schools in the cities. Okay, whereas these contract teachers are connected to the communities. They live less than a kilometer from home, whereas these guys are over 12 kilometers away. But these regular teachers are much more educated. About 85% have a college degree, and almost all of them have a formal teacher training certificate, whereas these contract teachers most of them have no formal training. Okay, so that's the big difference. More educated, more trained, okay, and also paid much, much higher salaries. So this was literally about 7 times more. And this is at about 2003 salaries. So now the contract teachers get about 5,000 and the regular teachers get paid about 40,000. Okay, so but that difference of 4 to 5x continues to be the case. All right. So this is a hugely controversial topic. Okay, so opponents, and this includes almost every professional education institution, including the national apex institutions, just absolutely hate the idea, right? They hate the idea of untrained teachers. They say this is going to deprofessionalize education. They think that the low wage is exploitation and that this is low motivation, and that they argue that they won't be effective. And the proponents point to greater accountability, connection to community. Sorry, I said accountability twice, okay? So again, there was multiple experimental studies of contract teachers all around the same time. So as in all of these cases, actually good. I knew I would never finish, so I didn't even put these slides. So let me just give you the results. So the results, what we find, so our experiment is, so these experiments are slightly different. So our experiment in India is looking at the marginal product of adding an extra contract teacher to the school, okay? But we don't have an experimental test of contract versus regular teacher, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So what we find is that this additional contract teacher is highly effective, and all of the non-experimental comparisons suggest that they're at least as effective, if not more effective, okay, than the regular teacher, though they're less expensive, paid much less educated, less trained. Now, one important caveat, this is all true for primary schooling, okay? And again, like Esther was saying, most of primary schooling, the basics, this is not rocket science, okay? So if you look at the Balsaki paper, that was also kind of young women of a 10th grade high school kind of education. So when you're talking about getting basic literacy, numeracy of skills of first, second, and third grade, it looks like you don't really need somebody more than a high school graduate, but who's actually there, okay, compared to somebody who's much more educated, but who's absent much more and not connected to the community. But that result may not hold once you get to middle school, where the content knowledge starts becoming more and more important. Okay, so that's an important caveat. And then Esther, Pascaline, and Michael find pretty much the same thing in Kenya. Okay. And so their experiment is a within school experiment that allows you to compare regular and contract teachers. But, in general, it turns out that both of these comparisons with regular teachers, in our case, you have to use non-experimental stuff. In their case, it's bundled with other things. So, but it's still strongly suggestive that the contract teacher is at least as effective, okay? Now, the problem with this is then you have this Bold et al. Paper that's also in Kenya, and they are testing two different variants, one implemented by nonprofit, one implemented by the government. And they basically argue that most of these results show up when you implement with a nonprofit, but not with the government. And I think the big vexing issue with all of these studies is that the evidence is very clear that performance pay works. The evidence is very clear that the contract teachers work, okay? But scaling this up runs into massive political problems. I'll come to that in a second. So, but then coming back to this question of exploitation, okay, so this is the top picture showing you the contract teacher salary distribution. And it's true, right, that they're paid much, much, much less than the civil service teachers, okay? But if you look at the salaries of the private school teachers, most elite Indians. So one quick way I have of kind of figuring out how disconnected somebody in an urban capital is from reality is by asking them what they think is the salary ratio of a public school teacher to a private school teacher. And your typical answer in the drawing rooms of Delhi will be, oh, the private school teachers get paid more. And that's because they're looking at private schools catering to the top 0.1% of the population, okay? But if you look at your typical private school, your average private school actually pays even lower salaries than the contract teachers, okay? So what this tells you is it's not that the contract teachers are underpaid because this is the market norm. It's rather that the civil service pay is insanely high, okay? And this partly explains why you get like 200 or 300 applicants or like tens of, millions of applicants for thousands of jobs every time there's a public sector job opening, okay? And why there's also like a market for fake teacher training credentials because everybody wants to play this government job lottery and, you just buy your degree and you show up. So then again, that would explain why there's no correlation between teacher training and effectiveness. Okay, so Jishnu and Nasim will talk a little bit more about the private school market. Okay, but this is just giving you a sense of just where because my focus was on governance, really value for money, right? I mean, so the 80% of our money goes to salaries. This unconditional increase in salaries have no impact. You're able to pay much lower salaries and get the same impact for these basics of primary school education. And but we're not doing this, okay? So my last slide, and I'll stay over 10, 15 minutes and take questions. Okay, so, but there's been three main concerns about expanding the use of contract teachers, okay? There's this, like I said, there's a long-term concern that you're going to deprofessionalize and reduce the quality of education systems. There's a question of the sustainability of a two-tier system, okay? So there's also serious legal problems because people will go and contract teacher unions regularly take this to courts and saying this is violating equal pay for equal work, okay? That we're sitting side by side doing the same job. How can you pay us 10 times less, okay? And the courts have often found in favor of that. And then there's the political problems, which is that once you have enough contract teachers, they'll all lobby to become civil service teachers. And we saw this problem in the state of Madhya Pradesh in India, that in 2003, in fact, it was considered a poster child of success with their education guarantee scheme based mainly on locally hired contract teachers. And the absence then was about 15%. By 2010, the absence had gone up to 26%. And in our more recent data in 2017, the absence went up to like 35%. And part of the problem was that they froze regular teacher hiring, okay? And then after years and years of contract teachers, one fine day, the political pressure was too much and they regularized all of them. And then you got the worst of both worlds, okay? You got the untrained teachers who got regularized, so you didn't have the accountability either, okay? So one of my kind of policy ideas, which I kind of passionate, if tomorrow I was advising an education minister in India or anywhere in the world, one of the things I would really, really push hard that is based on the evidence, but is also politically, legally, administratively feasible, okay, is to basically create, modify the structure of teacher training. Okay, so right now, the teacher training programs, they have no effect. And one reason is the degrees are fake. The other reason is the lack of incentives, which is the complementarity I told you. But there's a third reason, which is if you go look at the content of these teacher training programs, a lot of it is history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, but with remarkably little practical experience of how to teach, okay? And if you look at some kind of suggestive evidence around the world, the more effective programs tend to be practicum based. Okay, so the idea here is to kind of revamp the nature of teacher training to create like 3 to 4 year practicum based training programs where you have modular training, classroom training of theory for 2 to 3 months, and practical training for 8 to 9 months, where you're working as an apprentice, but in a government, in an existing school, in your same village. Okay, so so the demographic of people who get into this would be the same as people who are today coming in as contract teachers, right? So you recruit high school graduates into this teacher training program and you pay them a stipend. Okay, so this becomes an aspirational program to be into, but you're solving all three of those problems above, right? Because now you're saying that it's not that I'm permanently hiring untrained teachers. I'm improving the quality of the teacher training by giving you both theory and practice. Okay, so you solve the professional problem. You solve the legal problem because this is no longer equal pay for equal work, but this is now part of your training. It's part of your education. And so an apprenticeship is well recognized legally as like a different type of contract, and it's also time bound, right? So this is not like you're staying as a contract teacher for 10 years and then you're like, this is unfair. So you do that for 4 years. And then the way you solve the political problem of regularization is by saying that at the time of regular teacher hiring, can I provide extra year points and credit, like, for years of practical experience? Okay, so this is not guaranteeing you a regular job, but it's going to give you extra points. And so that way, you're not creating the political pressure of building cohort after cohort of contract teachers who are never getting hired, but you're creating a system whereby the most effective teachers who go through the practicum can, in fact, get these highly paid civil service jobs. Okay, so let me stop there. But for those of you who are interested not just in the research, but also the policy, I also highly recommend this extended podcast I did, which I put on the reading list. It's about 3.5 hours, but it really is kind of a deep dive into Indian education because we talk about the philosophy, the ethics, and the political issues, as well as the research and how you take all of these ideas and then come up with ways of implementing them. Because the problem is that even this is one of these really politically difficult issues where even when the evidence says that the across-the-board pay increases are having no effect, and all of these things are effective, they become politically much harder. So then you have to think about other dimensions of feasibility. Okay, so let me stop there and take questions.
We have a question from Jose Pinilla. Some other countries like Peru seem to be focusing on evaluating teachers' knowledge through exams that allow them to move on to higher pay. Is there any direct evidence on whether levels of teacher knowledge matter? Does the evidence on the lack of influence of levels of pay tell us anything about this?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And in fact, I strongly agree with the direction that Peru's taking in the sense that I think, to be honest, in public bureaucracies, implementing performance-based pay and promotions is still, I think, a bridge too far. But I think implementing competence-based pay and promotions where you have this additional testing, I think can be a really useful first step, okay? And in fact, that Indonesia doubling intervention was also supposed to link the pay increase to like a certification process where you were to upgrade your skills. But the problem is by the time that upgrading got politically negotiated, it had been diluted to just submitting a portfolio of your work, which had no bite. Whereas I think if you actually insist on competence and subject knowledge, that I think really can't, I don't know of evidence on that yet. There's a recent paper, not published yet. I think I've seen the slides of a science education program in India where they test the teachers on their, not just their content knowledge, but also on their pedagogical knowledge, right? So they give them a series of student answers and ask them to identify the student errors. So there's 3 ways of, assessing teacher knowledge. There's teacher knowledge on the content itself, and then there's teacher knowledge on teaching practices, and there's teacher's knowledge of ability to identify errors. So and if I'm not mistaken, they at least find a strong correlation between teacher performance on that knowledge test and their value added. So what that suggests is that the doubling has no effect because it was not linked in any measure to competence. But if you're meaningfully able to kind of have this as a competence filter, and perhaps even make that as a condition for continuing, right? So one hybrid between kind of the annual contract teachers who have no job security, and you could argue that that's kind of untenable, versus the tenure for life, is have an intermediate system of 5 to 10-year contracts. Okay, so there's a certain amount of stability that allows the teachers to invest in the teaching profession, but at the same time, if you need to get recertified every 5 years or 10 years, like doctors have to do that, it gives you incentives to stay on top of kind of what's going on, stay on top of your content knowledge. So I think that may be a politically feasible intermediate step, but I'm not aware of high quality evaluations, but I am cautiously optimistic that has a chance of working.
Why don't we take this next one as the last question, since we're a little bit over time. So this is from Rubeya Murshid. Do you agree that social status plays a role in incentivizing individuals to opt to become school teachers? For example, in Bangladesh, university graduates with top results would not in general aspire to become school teachers. Is there evidence on how to attract top students to become school teachers? Do you think this matters enough for the government to intervene and incentivize individuals to choose the profession?
Right. It's a good question, but I think, again, in a way, missing the point. And here's why. Okay. So I do think social status matters, right? But I think it is exactly this kind of thinking, right, that says we're not attracting the best graduates into teaching, that takes us down, I think, the suboptimal path of very high across the board pay, right? And if you look at all of the results I've shown you today, right, the way we have approached trying to build quality education is to saying, let's hire the most qualified teachers in an exam and then post them to where they're needed, okay? But what the data shows is that the most qualified teachers simply don't want to be in the rural areas, okay? So the wage differential, if you can get somebody local at 1/3 the pay or 1/4 the pay, but hire 4 times as many of them, you're going to get much better learning outcomes. Now, again, this is true only for primary schooling. Okay, this may not be true when you get to higher education. So at that point, the quality quantity trade-off may change, right? That you may be better off having one really knowledgeable teacher with a class of 100 students rather than 4 mediocre teachers, like, with 25 students each, because what matters at that point is content knowledge. And I think Eddie Lazier has this other very nice paper on class size, right? That class size really matters when kids are young, right? Because you're being socialized into the process of learning and you need the individual attention, okay? But once you know how to sit down, take notes, and kind of learn, once you can teach and be a good student, then at that point, the difference between a lecture of 50 and a lecture of 200, I mean, it's not 0, but it's not 4 times that would justify kind of, hiring 4 times as many teachers. So the long answer to your question, I think that question itself reflects what I believe is kind of the elite bias in how we think about our education systems, which is we're sitting in state capitals and thinking about, what it takes to get the very best, but that's not, in fact, the binding constraint for the vast majority of the education system, where what you really need. So my overall view for state capacity across sectors is that given that most of the needs are in underserved areas where people who are more educated don't want to go, that you're going to be much better off hiring people from the communities and investing in upskilling them rather than saying, I'm going to hire the most qualified person and expect them to go to a remote rural area where they don't want to go. And, Chris Nielsen has some very nice work looking at spatial allocations of teachers. And this kind of pattern shows up across the board. So yeah, so that's my quick answer. So again, social status matters, but sometimes it can backfire, right? Because part of the problem is precisely because the social status of the teachers in this village is so high that they are not socially connected to the village. There's literally nobody of their peer group, right? I mean, in this kind of upper middle class government employee, so they don't live in the village, they live far away and they're not connected to the communities where they teach. And so that's kind of why I think even with social status, it's a good thing, but beyond the point that social status becomes social distance, which is counterproductive for effective service delivery. All right. Yeah. So yeah, I think we're over. So let me stop there. So what I'm going to do tomorrow is mainly talk about ed tech, but I'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes in the beginning talking about governance and then connecting back to governance and school management at the end. All right. Thanks, everyone.